He doesn't know you own the building. He's been talking for 10 minutes about the lease he just signed, the corner unit, the foot traffic, how proud his father is that he finally has a real storefront, instead of the folding tables he used to run at weekend markets. You nod, you smile, you ask the right follow-up questions. You do not tell him that the deposit he wired last month landed in an LLC with your name quietly buried 3 layers down in the paperwork. This is what $3.4 million and 11 years of not correcting people looks like. It started the way most things in your life started. Not with a plan, but with your father's friend Uncle Rashid needing help reading a commercial lease in 2013. You were 20, home from community college for the summer, and Rashid, who ran a small halal grocery 2 towns over, handed you a stack of paper he didn't understand and asked if you could just look at it. You didn't know commercial real estate. You knew how to read carefully, which turned out to be almost the same skill. You found a clause buried on page 4, a percentage rent provision tied to gross sales above a certain threshold, that would have quietly taken an extra 11% of Rashid's revenue in a good month, money he had no idea he was about to owe. You flagged it. He got it removed before signing. He hugged you in the parking lot and told your father you'd saved him from something he wasn't sure how to name. You didn't get paid for that. You didn't expect to. But something about it stayed with you, the fact that most small business owners in your community were signing leases they barely understood, from landlords who understood every clause perfectly, and that the difference between those two positions was the entire game. You spent the next 2 years reading everything you could find about commercial leases, cap rates, triple net structures, how strip mall ownership actually works underneath the storefronts everyone sees. Not because you had money to buy anything, because you wanted to understand the side of the transaction nobody in your family had ever been on. You graduated, took a forgettable job in logistics that paid enough to save aggressively, and kept watching. You watched which small commercial properties in immigrant-heavy neighborhoods sat listed for months because nobody with capital wanted to deal with tenants who paid in cash and negotiated leases through cousins. You watched those same properties throw off steady, unglamorous returns for the handful of people willing to actually show up and manage them properly. At 24, you bought your first one. A 4-unit strip building with a barber shop, a phone repair shop, a tailor, and 1 vacant unit, in a neighborhood most investors your age wouldn't drive through, let alone buy into. You paid $340,000, most of it borrowed, a sliver of it your own savings. The rest structured through a small local bank that actually understood the tenants, because they banked the same community. The first year was rough. The vacant unit sat empty for 5 months before you filled it with a small money transfer business that's been there ever since. Net income that year was $19,000. Unremarkable. Barely worth mentioning at a family dinner even if you'd wanted to mention it, which you didn't. But you weren't looking at the $19,000. You were looking at the fact that 4 small business owners, people who looked like your father, people who'd have been dismissed by any bank downtown, were paying rent to someone who understood their businesses, instead of someone who saw them as a liability. That felt like more than a return. It felt like the other side of Uncle Rashid's lease, finally. You bought a second building 3 years later. Then a third, a small mixed-use property with 2 retail units and 4 apartments above them, purchased from a retiring landlord who was tired and just wanted out. By 31, the 3 properties combined were netting just over $210,000 a year. And your accountant, a meticulous man named Farhan who has never once asked why you drive a 9-year-old Camry, told you flatly during your annual review that your portfolio had crossed $3.4 million in equity when you factored in appreciation and the paydown on the mortgages. You didn't celebrate. You went home and fixed a leaking faucet in one of the apartment units yourself, because the tenant, a single mother working 2 jobs, had been waiting a week for the property manager to get around to it, and you didn't want her waiting any longer than necessary. This brings you to today, standing in the corner unit of your second building, the one with the good foot traffic near the transit stop, listening to a young guy named Imran talk about the storefront he just signed for. He's maybe 23, the age you were when you were reading Uncle Rashid's lease in a parking lot. He's opening a small electronics repair shop, phone screens, laptop batteries, the kind of business your community always needs and rarely finds nearby. He's proud, genuinely, and you understand that pride completely. Because it's the exact pride you watched Rashid have over a lease you saved him from wrecking his margins on. Imran doesn't know who owns the building. The paperwork ran through a management company with a generic name, the way it always does. specifically so conversations like this one can happen without anyone doing math they weren't invited to do. He tells you the landlord seems fair, responsive, fixed a wiring issue within 2 days of him reporting it. He has no idea he's describing you. You could tell him. Right now, standing in his half-finished storefront with sawdust still on the floor, you could say the 4 words that would change how he sees you permanently. You don't. Not because you enjoy the secrecy for its own sake, but because you've learned exactly what happens the moment a small business owner in your community finds out the person across from them owns more than they assumed. The conversation stops being about phone repairs. It becomes about favors, extensions, whether the rent might be flexible this month because the landlord clearly has money. A phrase that erases every year of risk, and every faucet you fixed yourself to keep this thing running. Honestly, there's a version of you that could have told Rashid too, back at the very beginning. Could have said something like, "This is what I want to build one day. Watch for me." You didn't, because at 20 you didn't fully believe it yourself yet. And there's a strange gift in that too, in becoming something before you announce it, so that when it finally exists, it exists as a fact instead of a promise you made someone wait on. At a cousin's engagement dinner 2 weeks ago, a distant relative named Kamran spent half an hour describing the storefront he'd just leased downtown, the same tone Imran used, proud, a little performative, clearly wanting the table to be impressed. He described his landlord as some big real estate guy downtown, said it like it was intimidating, like being on the other side of that lease made someone important in a way he wasn't yet. Someone at the table asked Kamran if the rent was negotiable, and he said not really, the guy doesn't budge, which made him sound even more impressed rather than less, as if firmness were proof of seriousness. Nobody at that table knew you owned 4 commercial properties worth more combined than everything Kamran had described that night. You ate your food, you asked him what kind of foot traffic he was expecting, you let him have the room. Your mother, sitting beside you, mentioned in passing that she'd run into an old neighbor who asked how you were doing, career-wise, and whether you'd ever settle into something more permanent than whatever it is you do with properties. You told her you were doing fine, which was true in a way she had no framework to measure. She patted your hand and moved on to asking about your cousin's wedding date. You let that conversation happen too, the same way you let every conversation like it happen, because correcting the record would require explaining 11 years of decisions in a single sentence at a dinner table, and some things don't compress that easily. This is the part that doesn't get easier no matter how many times it happens. Sitting across from someone building the exact dream you once helped someone else protect, watching them describe you in the third person without knowing it, and choosing, every single time, to stay Imran's quiet, responsive landlord instead of becoming a name that changes the shape of every future conversation between you. You've thought about what it would mean to eventually tell people, not everyone, but the ones who matter. Your father, who still asks periodically if you're doing all right with money. A question that means something different coming from a man who spent 30 years running a small tailoring shop and worrying about rent every single month of it. He never missed a payment in 30 years, not once. Even the year business slowed so badly he took a second job cleaning offices at night to cover the gap. You think about showing him the deed to the first building someday, the one that started with Uncle Rashid's lease in a parking lot, and letting him understand that the son he worried about not choosing a stable career ended up owning the buildings stable careers operate out of. You haven't done it yet. Maybe you will. But tonight, you're just the guy in a worn flannel jacket standing in a half-finished electronics shop, nodding along while a 23-year-old tells you, without knowing it, that your building has been good to him. You shake his hand, wish him luck with the opening, and walk out to your Camry parked around the corner. On the drive home, you think about the faucet you fixed last month, about Rashid's lease from 11 years ago, about how the entire architecture of what you've built rests on nobody ever quite knowing which side of the table you're actually sitting on. You pass the old grocery store where this whole thing started, Rashid's place, still there, still running, the awning slightly more faded than it used to be. You slow down without meaning to. Rashid sold the business 2 years ago and moved closer to his grandchildren. But every time you pass that storefront, you think about the version of yourself who sat in a parking lot at 20, reading a lease he didn't fully understand yet, with no idea that the skill he was practicing would become the entire foundation of a life. You think, too, about the day you might finally stop staying quiet. Not with everyone. Maybe just with your father, showing him a deed instead of trying to explain a number he'd have no real way to picture. Maybe with Imran, years from now, once the electronics shop is steady, and the relationship has had time to become something other than landlord and tenant. You imagine that conversation sometimes, the specific look on someone's face when a fact they've been living next to finally becomes visible. You're not there yet. You might never be. Some nights that feels like patience. Other nights it feels like something closer to loneliness wearing a more respectable name. You own the building. He just bragged about renting the store inside it. And somewhere between those two facts is the entire quiet architecture of the life you've built. One lease, one faucet, one unannounced fact at a time.